Hi everybody, my name is Hannah, this is Pepper and Pine, and I have a hat tutorial to share with you today. I'm showing you the knitting needles that we're going to be using for this project. You can use 4 to 5 knitting needles as well as any type of yarn that you want. I'm using bulky weight yarn, so my needles are about size 10. I'm showing you some of the varieties of colors that I'm going to be using for today's project. This is a very slow tutorial. I will take you through the entire process, mistakes and all. So we are making hats for our homeschool. We're knitting hats, and I am doing this to learn how to do this so I can teach my son, and I will show you his project at the end of this video. So we're going to cast on, and I'm just making a loop with my finger with the yarn here. I've got about 1.5 yards of yarn. And next we're going to cast on. Now there are so many different ways to do this. I'm just going to show you this way now, where you kind of make an A shape with the yarn by holding it between your thumb and your index finger. And you're going to pull it down with your knitting needle. You're going to grab on either side of the yarn, and this way you're going to make your stitches. We're going to be making a child size hat, and so for this project we're going to be casting on 24 stitches on each needle, 3 of the needles. So I counted them up. You want to count them 2 by 2, and so I need a few more, but now we are all set to continue casting on our second needle. So we're going to do the same casting on method, and you just want to make sure that you're doing it pretty close to your first needle. Now it's time to get our third needle, but we want to count this for this project. You want to keep counting and making sure that you have the correct number of stitches on your needles as you do this whole project. We have our 3 needles, and once again we're going to count our stitches and make sure that we have 24, and I need 1 more for this needle. And now we are ready to knit. So we're going to take our 4th needle, but first I want to tie off that extra piece and make sure that I'm not knitting that tail. And I also want to make sure that I haven't twisted any of my needles, and this is really common at the beginning, so you want to make sure that they are not twisted. I did this once while making a hat, and I had to basically start all over. There was no way to remedy this. Okay, so we're going to start by knitting 2 and then purling 2. So I'm going to show this to you very slowly, and this is where it's a little bit complicated at first, because you're going to have kind of like 3 needles next to you while you're trying to knit this, and that's because one of the needles has the yarn, and then you're going to be knitting with the other 2. So we're going to go ahead and knit, and I am kind of a tight knitter. I do make my stitches pretty tight, and I do cast on pretty tightly, so I do end up struggling quite a bit with my knitting. Some people do this a lot more loosely, and you do want to find the middle ground. So now I have knit 2, and now we're going to purl 2. So I'm going to take my yarn, I'm going to put it in the front, and then I'm going to take my needle and then bring that towards the front, and then put my yarn around it and then tuck it in, and then my needle's going to end up on the outside, on the back, and we want to bring it back to the front, and then go ahead and do that again. There are many different ways to knit, and there are different ways to purl as well. So if you have a method that you prefer, you may go ahead and do that. And if you are doing this for the first time, I do recommend that you stick with the same style of knitting and purling until you become really comfortable and able to make those changes. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and finish up that second stitch with our knitting, and then we're going to go back to purling, and this will give you a nice ribbed edge for your hat. And we're going to be doing this along all 3 needles, And every time you go around once on all 3 needles, that will be 1 round, or you can call it a row, but I think a round is a little bit more accurate since we are going to be knitting in the round with all of these needles. You could also use different types of needles that, there's 2 needles that have kind of a cord in between them if you prefer. This is a typical project that you would find in a Waldorf setting at around grade 5, when children start to use multiple needles with their knitting projects. So I'm just about done here, and the last 2 on each of these needles is always going to be purling 2, and the first 2 stitches are always going to be knitting 2. And so now, in case you forget, you can count. You can also look at your stitches. Because this is all still fairly new to me, I did a lot of counting as I went along, but you can also look at your stitches. They will look different whether you are doing knitting or purling, and an experienced knitter could do this with their eyes closed, but I have to pay close attention while I'm doing this, and you'll be able to see some of the mistakes that I make later on when I just start on autopilot and I am not paying as much attention. Okay, so we're going to finish our second purl stitch here. This takes a lot of concentration in the beginning, and you want to do this for about 1 inch to 1.5 inches. And you can use any color, any pattern you'd like. I was not following any pattern, so I just would knit with whatever color I wanted. I would pull up the next pieces of yarn that I had. Sometimes I only had a little bit left and could only do 1 or 2 rows. And I just was playing around with this. For this project, I learned how to do 3 things. I learned how to knit and purl in order to make the ribbing. I learned how to knit with multiple needles, and I learned how to make a few patterns and designs with the different colors. It's really easy to get those yarns in a knot, so you can trim them off every time you switch colors, but I went ahead and I left them on so that as I needed them later on while I was knitting the hat, I could just pull them up from the project. However, if you pull too tightly on a piece of yarn that you haven't used in several rows or several rounds, you might distort the shape of your hat, so do bear that in mind. So I'm working on my very first pattern here, and I had gray for the ribbing and then brown for a few rows, and then I'm going to alternate the white with the brown. And once I do an entire round of alternating those 2 colors, I'm going to come back in with just the white, and I'm going to knit an entire round or entire row just with the white. And then for the 3rd row, I'm going to come in and alternate the white with either the brown or a different color. And because I'm working with all these different neutrals, I was running low on a lot of yarn. And so part of my pattern is just dictated by which yarns I actually had left. So these are all Lamb's Pride bulky weight yarn in cream and gray and then some other heathered colors. All right, so now it's time to finish that pattern. This will be the 3rd row, and I'm going to alternate with the white, and I use a gray rather than the brown that I started out with for this pattern, and that's fine. You can get all kinds of designs. I would just say that you want to stay consistent as you go along with this so that you do produce a pattern rather than having something that's a little bit chaotic. But again, you can do whatever you'd like. Part of this project for my son, who is 13, is to learn how to knit with multiple needles, to do the ribbing, which is the knitting and the purling, and to do some simple patterns. So you'll be able to see his project in the end. He did fabulous. Now this one I'm making for my daughter, and she is 9 years old. So the size of this hat in the end will fit a 9-year-old child or a very young child. The size that my son made, which is very similar to this one, ended up being a beanie for my husband. And then I made one for him, which was a lot larger, and that could fit an adult or a teen. Okay, so once we are done with a basic pattern, then we're going to just keep knitting in whatever colors and designs you would like. You need to knit for about 5 to 6 inches depending on what size hat you want to make. You also may choose to cast on more stitches if you want the hat to have a wider opening, and you can also cast on fewer stitches if you want a smaller hat. So we're up to about 4 to 4.5 inches at this point. And we're going to start the descending or decreasing part of the project. And it will still take about an inch or two to decrease enough that we can bind off our project. And in order to do this, you need to make some markers throughout your project to make sure you know where to decrease. So I'm just going to be using another color yarn for this, and after every 8 stitches I'm going to tie off this yarn in a contrasting color. You want to make sure that you don't accidentally knit this while you're doing your project. And then I'm going to count another 8 stitches and then use another marker, and in this way you will know where you need to knit 2 stitches together in order to decrease enough that you can make the top of your hat. I'm going to go ahead and add that final marker at the end of this needle. You need to do it for all 3 needles. You probably don't need to do the very last one, but because this was one of my very first projects, I want to make sure that I had them on all 3 needles. They will slip off, so do be mindful of them. I'm also going to tie off some of these loose pieces to make sure that I don't accidentally knit them. I have done that in the past, so you want to be careful with that. And now we can go ahead and knit the first 2 together. It was hard to see there, but I put 2 stitches onto 1 needle. And I'm going to remember to do that after every marker. So after I knit the 2 together, we're just going to knit 1 all the way till we get to the next marker. So we're just knitting 1 stitch at a time. Then you want to slide your marker over onto your needle, and then you want to knit 2 again. But here's where I make a mistake. I forget to knit 2, and I only knit the 1. And I'm sorry that this might be confusing if you are doing this for the first time, but I do want to show you my mistake and how I fix it. So I should have knit 2 together right after the marker, and I didn't. And as I get to the end of this little section and I'm about to put the next marker on, I recognize my mistake and I double check it by counting them. And I should have been down 1 stitch. I should have gone from 8 stitches down to 7 stitches. So we're going to undo our knitting and we're going to basically unknit. And this is probably the only remedy that I know. You can pull them all out, but since we only have a few to do, you might as well just unknit. For other mistakes, since I'm such a novice knitter, sometimes we just have to live with our mistakes, and that's just another way to appreciate the mistakes that you make when you're knitting, especially for a child, because they are certainly going to make a lot of little mistakes as they're knitting. So now I've knit those 2 together. Now I can continue just knitting 1 of those stitches at a time until I get to the next marker, and that's why counting is so important for this project, so that you make sure that you have decreased properly. And then after that marker again, I'm going to knit 2 together, and then I'll go ahead and continue knitting the rest of that section with just 1 stitch at a time. And so, don't forget that marker. We want to put that onto the needle as well. And so this way we have decreased the number of stitches from 24 to 21. And you do want to remember to keep track of going around all 3 needles as 1 round. And in order to remember that, you could actually just mark it with another color marker or continue to count stitches, which is going to be really important. And that's why one of the reasons for me, I had to really be mindful of what I was doing, and I couldn't multitask when it came to knitting this hat. And sure enough, I make another mistake, but I fix it off camera, and I did the same thing where I had to unknit until I found my mistake. Okay, so at this point, we're going to knit 2 rounds normally in between every decreasing round. So you'll decrease, then you'll knit 2 normal rounds, and then you will decrease again. Okay, so we're up to about 5 or 6 inches, and we're down to about 9 stitches on each needle. And we're going to continue doing this where we're, oh, let me show you this. I pulled a little bit too hard. You can see there's a little bit of a hole there. No big deal. We're going to stitch that up later. It's just because we were changing colors. But here you don't want to pull on that yarn too much. You want to make sure that it's just enough that there's still yarn inside the hat. Otherwise, you're going to distort your pattern as you go around. Okay, so I'm going to dispense with the markers at this point because I'm down to just 9 stitches, and now I'm down to 6 stitches per needle. And so now that we're down to so few, we're nearly ready to bind off, and we didn't need the markers anymore. So to bind off, you're going to knit 2, and then you're going to slip your first stitch over your second one, and then you're going to continue knitting 1 and then slipping that first stitch over the second one that you're knitting. So at this point we only have 6 stitches per needle, but you can see it's getting quite tight all the way here at the top. And I want to show you what it looks like when you finally can remove one of those needles, because it is quite crowded once you get to the top. And there's still a lot of extra yarn, but don't worry, we're going to fix that all up in a little bit. But we want to continue binding off. I'm going to dispense with that final needle there, and now we're going to continue doing 1 stitch and then taking that first stitch and pulling it right over that previous stitch. Okay, so now we're all the way at the end. You're going to just be left with 1 stitch left on your needle. You want to carefully remove your needle and trim your yarn. And then you're going to take that piece of yarn and slip it right through that stitch and gently pull it closed, and it's just going to tie it off, and then you're done. Okay, so we're going to trim off some of this extra yarn, and now we need to just close up that top right there. It's going to close up nice and snug, and you're not even going to be able to tell there was a little hole there before. So I've got all this extra yarn here, and there's a couple of different ways to deal with that, but first let's sew the top together. I have a knitting needle here. It has a blunt tip and a larger eye so that we can fit our yarn through, but that was really bulky yarn. And I'm going to tie off the end here, and I'm going to sew the top closed. So I'm going to just go ahead and start at one end, and oh, that went right through. So let's see if we can do that again. And it goes through again. So that's just not going to work. We want to have a larger knot. So instead of doing a single strand of yarn, I'm going to go ahead and pull those 2 pieces together. I'm going to knot both pieces of yarn together. And I'm just going to twirl it around the tip of my needle and then take that all the way down. This is a tip that I learned at a Waldorf Handwork conference recently. Then you got a nice, tight, snug knot right there. Okay, so we're going to go ahead, and at the very tip where you've bound off your knitting, we're going to go ahead and just go like maybe every other stitch. We're going to just take our needle right through that piece and pull gently on your yarn. So maybe every 2 or 3 stitches. And in this way, it's just going to close it off nice and snug. As soon as I make it all the way around the top, then you can, or all the way around, you can then now go another loop around with every third or fourth stitch that you didn't get the first time. So we're basically going to go around the top about 2 times, and that's going to ensure that it stays nice and tightly closed. You can see it doesn't even look like there was an opening there before. And then in order to knot it off and tie it off, we're going to just slip our needle right through into the center and pull it out the other end. Such a nice finish there. And then we want to knot it in on the inside. And I had some other yarn there, so I decided just to tie those 2 pieces together, and I think I do about 3 knots to ensure that it stays nice and tightly closed. And then I'm going to just weave that extra yarn into the hat just a little bit before I trim it off, and that way there's a longer tail that's within the hat, and that just ensures that in case it starts to unravel, you'll have a little bit of a tail left, and it's just going to be wound up inside the hat. Okay, so we have all these other extra pieces here, and at this point, I'm going to tie them off. You don't need to tie them off. They should stay without unraveling, but if you want to be on the safe side, then go ahead and tie them off. And also, this is a good time to make sure that the pattern does line up and that you can stitch in any holes, because when you're changing colors, you're going to find that you might produce a couple of holes where when you first start your knitting on those first 2 knitting needles where you're changing your colors, you might find that you've produced a little hole. It's no big deal. You can use a needle and some yarn and you can just mend that. Okay, so this was at the very beginning. We didn't tie off our original yarn, so I'm going to go ahead and do that now. I tied it off and then I just kind of wove it back into the hat just a little bit. All right, so the hat is complete. It is super adorable. I love it. You could do a little pom-pom up at the top, but I decided to leave it without. But you can see these 3 hats now. This one that I just showed you the tutorial for, this one is for my 9-year-old daughter. And it's about 6 inches and it fits her just right. And this one ended up being a beanie for an adult and it's about 7 inches. And then this is the first one that I made. I made it for my son with my own experimental patterns, and it's about 8 or 9 inches, and it does have a little pom-pom up at the top, and it's super adorable. They're really warm and soft, but a little bit scratchy if you are sensitive. And I just want to show you at what point we started to decrease. So for this hat at about 5 inches, and then I started to decrease. And then for the beanie, I knitted about 3.5 to 4 inches before decreasing. Actually, my son did that one. And then for this one, we knitted about 4.5 inches before decreasing. Don't forget to check out the blog post that accompanies this video for more pictures as well as links to the materials that we used. You can find that link down in the description box below. And if you'd like to see some of our other Waldorf handwork projects, you can tap on the screen right now. That playlist is down in the description box below. And don't forget that if you want to see what our homeschool looks like on a daily basis, you can find me on Instagram at Pepper and Pine.